All right. I think this is working. Technology is not my strong suit, so hopefully this all goes to plan. I apologize if the sound is a little bad. I wish I knew how to fix that. Anyway, my name is Grant Miller, and this is my video presentation for Global Anabaptism. And my topic is on the life and work of John Driver. Instead of critiquing Driver, I'm seeking to focus on how he impacted the Mennonite Church and in what ways. In general, Driver is known for his work and influence in Latin America. While this is undoubtedly true, a lot of this assessment is done by North American Mennonites. And while this doesn't negate their observations or arguments, I'm suggesting it might omit the role and importance that Driver has played within the life and thought of the North American Church. Excuse me. My contention is that Driver should be considered a theologian and missiologist for the North American Church, not just a figure within Latin American Anabaptism. And so North American Mennonites should note and appreciate the influence that the Latin American context had on Driver's work, particularly liberation theology and the charismatic movement. As Mennonites in North America continue to grapple with what it means to be a missional church, along with the issues of race and poverty and violence, Driver's work could prove to be a valuable resource. Such cross-cultural fermentation could prove to be very beneficial. However, North American Mennonites need to be aware that Driver also relied heavily on Yoder, the Anabaptist vision, Wilbert Schenck, and other Mennonite thinkers to help interpret and adopt the new ideas that he encountered. Arguably, Driver did this with skill and great success, but the church needs to be aware that the gaps or holes within that branch of Mennonite thought could also be present within Driver's work. Yet even with such a caveat, Driver's work and influence could also be appreciated and emulated as a faithful approach to Anabaptist mission. So I will give the bit on the history and then the theology. So, excuse me, John Driver was born in Heston, Kansas in 1924, but moved to Puerto Rico in 1945 as a CPS, civilian public service worker, working in post-war relief. Mennonite involvement in Puerto Rico had only begun a couple of years earlier with the first CPS workers, and so Driver was on the forefront of that and paved the way for Mennonite mission agencies to pick up much of the work that the CPSers had been doing. Driver spent 18 years then in Puerto Rico working in community development, church planting, and pastoral care leadership development. And while working there, he encountered a deep kind of poverty that he had not known before. He also witnessed how young Puerto Rican men felt forced to join the U.S. military as a means to provide for their family. Upon their death, their families would receive money from the government, but at the extreme cost of losing their son. After nearly 2 decades in Puerto Rico, graduated from Goshen College and Goshen Biblical Seminary, Driver was invited to be the academic dean and professor of church history and New Testament at the Inter-Mennonite Seminary in Montevideo in 1967. The 7 years Driver spent there were also provided a crucial lens with the national liberation and revolutionary movements that were sweeping Latin America and the pressure to align with either the revolutionaries or traditionalists. The community at the seminary began to reread scripture in a search for a, quote, third way, apart from the dominating liberal and conservative voices. While Driver was teaching in Uruguay, John Howard Yoder took a year-long sabbatical teaching at the Inter-Mennonite Seminary and Union Theological in Buenos Aires. Yoder's work and lectures at the seminaries had a deep influence on Driver. In 1971, at actually a conference at AMBS where Yoder was presenting, Wilbert Schenck presented the question to the group gathered of why the Anabaptist vision had not made a discernible difference in the way Mennonites did God's mission in the world. And this question really brought together for Driver Anabaptism and his experience in Latin America. And as Yoder said from that moment, he, quote, vowed to become more intentional in making a radical vision of the gospel together with a reading of our context key elements in my witness. So this reorientation to commit fully to engage with the specific Latin American context Driver found himself in, and with the lens of Anabaptist vision in Yoder's thought, started to be the driving force of Driver's work. On top of that, or specifically with that Latin American context, was Driver's encounter with liberation theology. Already in Puerto Rico, Driver had encountered liberation theology, especially the preferential option for the poor, which resonated with his experience working with impoverished peoples. But in South America, Driver encountered even more liberation theologians, particularly Enrique Dussal, church historian who presented the history of the church as ordinary men and women who committed to radically following Christ. And this resonated with Driver with Anabaptist vision, with Anabaptists also being a remnant of the faithful church, and as well as the Constantinian shift that Yoder championed. As the interaction of Driver's Anabaptism and engagement with liberation theology developed, he began publishing some of his first books, primarily for Spanish-speaking audience. His first book in 1974 was Comunidad y Compromiso, followed by Militantes para un Mundo Nuevo in 78. Both books were translated to English a couple years after their Spanish editions. And in 1978, Driver, along with Samuel Escobar, who had also been influenced by Yoder, presented at AMBS on the integration of Christian mission and social justice. And out of these lectures came the book Christian Mission and Social Justice. In 1974, the seminary in Montevideo closed down, and the Drivers were invited to accompany churches in Spain, Mennonite churches. These churches really started to embody Driver's vision of a missional church, and quickly began community ministries of supporting conscientious objectors, serving people with mental disabilities, and working with those recovering from drug addiction. And along with working with these Mennonite communities, Driver started to speak widely outside of Mennonite circles as well. Initially working off of the connections he had made with InterVarsity back in South America, Driver was soon engaging with what he called emerging radical communities and also conservative evangelical churches. As Driver interacted with these two groups, he developed the need to articulate an atonement that jived with his mission missiology. And so with the encouragement and consultation of Wilbert Shank, he wrote Understanding the Atonement Church. By the mid-'80s, leadership in the Spanish churches was thriving, and the Drivers decided to return to South America. And so for the next 5 years in South America, and then well into his retirement in Goshen, Driver traveled widely throughout South America and Latin America, teaching and talking with many people. Particularly, Driver visited the Anabaptist communities in Colombia numerous times, especially during the 80s and 90s, during the height of La Violencia. All three groups continually invited Driver back, even though they differed with each other, and drew on him as a resource for navigating the violence of their situation. An idea Driver had started in Spain but didn't come to fruition until a series of lectures at Semilla in the 90s was the book Images of the Church and Mission. And so over 50 years of ministry, Driver's influence is evident throughout Latin America and even Latino communities in North America and Anabaptist circles in Spain. So So Driver's influence on the growth and development of Anabaptism in Latin America is widely acknowledged. Juan Martinez is an article we read for class, most widely read Anabaptist theologian in Latin America, and more influential than Yoder as well. But the experience of John Driver has also informed and influenced Mennonites in North America well, and I'll try and pull that out more in the theology section. So I'm suggesting there are at least three that I'm highlighting here, characteristics or influences of John Driver's work in theology. The first is liberation theology, which has already been touched on a little bit. Liberation theology was an integral part of the theological landscape in Latin America while Driver was there, and a number of the characteristics, especially the preferential option for the poor and the rereading of church history, resonated with Driver and his understanding of Anabaptism as well. So Driver came to distill and synthesize his understanding of liberation theology along with his Anabaptism as a third way, a redemptive third way, which he said, quote, which is forgiving and freely assuming the cross of suffering is a way towards that ultimate reconciliation that will include all, even the enemy. So it became a third way that meant a path of restoration for the oppressor and healing for the sufferer. These two sides met in ultimate reconciliation. The second characteristic is the charismatic movements in Pentecostalism that Driver encountered. In the 50s and 60s, Mennonite churches in Latin America frowned upon the charismatic movement, but by the 70s, North American mission workers began to encourage such expression, particularly because charismaticism became more accepted in North America at the time. And Driver was present in Latin America for these developments. But perhaps more importantly, Driver interacted with various other Christian groups outside of Anabaptism, starting particularly with InterVarsity, but then in Spain, many conservative evangelical groups across Spain, and then after moving back to South America, speaking widely and teaching on many different subjects, including pneumatology and the role of the Spirit in the Messianic community. While none of these historical markers may represent a distinct Pentecostal or charismatic impact on Driver's life, his works bear the fruits of such encounters. Nearly all his writings, Driver takes care to pay attention to the role and power of the Holy Spirit. In the book Kingdom Citizens, one of his earliest books, which is about the ethical and theological dimensions of kingdom living, Driver also pulls out the spirituality of the kingdom. In a book written much later for Mennonite World Conference, Life Together in the Spirit, about a radical spirituality for the 21st century. And finally, Images of the Church, which came together after lectures in Guatemala. Driver developed a biblical image of a temple to display the pneumatic and charismatic structure of the church. And in this depiction, the dynamic nature of the church cannot be contained by institutional orders or hierarchy, but can only strive through the supernatural gifts of the Spirit in a charismatic community. So intention Driver continually gives to the spiritual and charismatic nature of mission in the church, I suggest must be attributed, at least in part, to the Pentecostalism and the charismatic movement in the Latin American context that deeply informed his perspective. Finally, Driver is also most well known as a missiologist and a practitioner of missional church theology. Mennonites in North America were slow to develop missions in comparison to other denominations, and their mission practice often mirrored or was patterned off of their Protestant counterparts. So when Driver began his work in 1945, he was really on the forefront of developing an explicitly Anabaptist missiology. As I've said before, he was intentional about drawing from Mennonite scholarship. Yoder deeply influenced him, especially regarding church history. The language of a third way is part of somewhat Walter Clausen's idea of Anabaptism being either Protestant or Catholic. Also, Wilbert Schenck, his encouragement to adherence with the Anabaptist vision and being a mentor and resource for Driver throughout his ministry. But Driver's missiology is not solely theoretical. He was a practitioner on the ground. And so that's where liberation theology really started to integrate because of how it resonated with what Driver saw in that context. This can perhaps most clearly be seen in Images of the Church and Mission, as it outlines biblical images that Driver understands to be how the church does mission. With these images in mind, Driver can read back through church history to determine faithful expressions of mission and identify as well as prescribe current forms of radical and faithful mission. And Driver comes out with a book in 2000, Radical Faith and Alternative History of Christian Church, that is clearly articulates that vision. So Driver's theology clearly had an impact on Anabaptist churches in America. As already been noted, he was said to be the most influential theologian in Latin America, for Mennonites more so than even Yoder. John Roth has gone so far as to suggest that if Mennonites were to have saints, John Driver should be the first to be nominated. However, perhaps Roth's suggestion illuminates more about Driver's influence on the North American church than the church in Latin America. Driver's work will continue to be assessed and reinterpreted by Anabaptists in Latin America, and will most likely still prove useful and profound. His books are still a core part of the curriculum at SEMIA. However, in Jaime Prieto's book, the English version is the condensed version of the history of Mennonites in Latin America. Driver's listed a few times as someone who was present, a leader, a counselor for various consequential moments, but not as a theological and missiological source that churches drew from. Now, this doesn't negate Driver's influence or value to churches in Latin America, but it may suggest that Driver's influence as a theological giant is perhaps more alive in the minds of North Americans who are aware of it than the churches in Latin America reevaluate it. So as North Americans continue to think about their mission practices and develop Anabaptist missiology, Driver can serve as an example, and does serve an example of how Mennonites have tried to do this. He drew off Mennonite thinkers such as Yoder and Schenck, and by the end of his ministry was held up as a model for how Mennonites should practice contextual and missional Anabaptist theology and history. Longtime mission worker Neil Blau in France said at one point that Driver, along with Joe Lichty and Alan Kreider, were Mennonites who were doing important creative and historical scholarship in quite varied contexts. So while Driver's legacy in Latin America will continue to be reassessed by the churches there, his influence on the North American church and the missiology and theology of the church in North America is perhaps more cemented as the images of mission that Driver offered continue to reverberate in how the church understands mission to be done or to be possible. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. It was a pleasure being in class with all of you. Maybe I'll see you around campus sometime.